Okay, we're going to look at congressional oversight. And oversight is just Congress's responsibility to make sure that the executive branch is doing what it's supposed to do, especially when it comes to money. If they're going to appropriate millions or billions of dollars, we need to double check and make sure that these agencies are working the way that they're supposed to. So obviously it's the responsibility of Congress to create these agencies, and the statutes that they make influence and determine the behavior of these agencies. We went through the lawmaking process, but we never really talked about authorization legislation and appropriations legislation. We did talk about what appropriating money was, but in order to fund these different agencies, money must be authorized in a legislative committee, and that's one of those standing permanent committees. And so the legislation to spend money originates in one of these committees, and they outline the maximum amount that these agencies can spend. And the legislation can be permanent, or we can fix it for a number of years, or it might have to be authorized annually. But once it goes through that legislative committee and we have authorization, then it has to go to the House Appropriations Committee. So we have to authorize it, and then we have to appropriate it. And the appropriations on these funds are done annually, and almost always the amount that is appropriated is less than what the standing committee has actually authorized. And so this usually is people complaining about the budget being out of control, that we're spending more money than we're taking in, and so the Appropriations Committee is the one that's going to take what the authorizing committee says and says, you're definitely not going to get that much money. And so the agencies, once again, serving more than one master. There are conflicting goals for the authorizing and the appropriations committees. So these agencies have to get it authorized, but then they also have to work through the appropriations. And notice it has to originate in the House Appropriations Committee. It cannot originate in the Senate. We've talked about that before. Spending money and taxing has to start in the House of Representatives. A couple other congressional oversight tools that Congress has is to call agencies, heads of agencies on behalf of constituents so they can get involved there. And there's another thing called a committee clearance. Congressional committees obtain the right to pass on certain agency decisions, not usually binding, but the agency heads won't ignore this before taking action. And really what this is congressional committees reviewing before the fact, so they can look at what the agency's decisions are in advance, and they can give them feedback and input into what these agencies are going to do. And then investigation. They have legislative power, and so it is inferred that they can investigate what these agencies are doing, and this has been upheld by the Supreme Court. Looking just a little bit more specifically into the Appropriations Committee, the real power over the agency's budget is exercised in this committee, because once again, the authorizing committee can authorize as much money as they want to, but the power of the purse really is in the hands of the Appropriations Committee. And they have a lot of power in the markup process of writing legislation, and the markup again is where they revise, they amend, they make the bill into exactly what it's going to be. So it gives this committee substantial influence over the policies that the agency has to follow. Your textbook does talk about how this Appropriations Committee has recently lost some of its power, and several reasons for that is because there have been some what they call trust funds created. Social Security is a trust fund. It operates outside the government budget because it's what's called a mandatory spending account. It's an entitlement. Everyone who is entitled to get it is going to get it. So it doesn't have to be appropriated. That money has to be spent. It is mandatory. So it doesn't have to go through that process, and the committee has no control over that expenditure. It is automatic. And then Congress has changed authorization from permanent to multi or annual authorization. So you're seeing NASA and the State Department's budget, the Department of Justice, the Department of Education. Instead of having permanent authorization, they're going back every single year and authorizing different amounts. And then finally, the budget deficits. Congress is trying to meet target spending limits because of people just getting angry that we are operating at a deficit year after year after year. And the final oversight tool is the legislative veto. And I have 2 videos posted that I want you to take a look at. One of them is Representative Ted Yoho, and he is on the floor of the House talking about the legislative veto, and then there's a short video on what the legislative veto is. And this is a check on the bureaucratic or presidential actions, and it's after the fact. The requirement that an executive decision must lie before Congress for a specific period of time, usually to 30 or 90 days before it can take effect. And Congress has the ability to do a one-house veto, either the House or the Senate. I've got the INS versus CHATA, the OYES page, and then I also have a short video that explains this. In this case, the Supreme Court overruled Congress's legislative veto. They still use it. Nobody's challenged it since then, which I think is interesting. But opponents of the veto say Congress should pass laws that clearly state what agencies may or may not do, opposed to giving all of this discretionary authority to these agencies and then after the fact saying, no, sorry, you can't do that. So take some time and watch those videos.